One of the things that I think that the prosecution is probably going to be struggling with here is memory, because these allegations, like Jane, the victim, for example, she's the one that testified on day 2 and day 3. She testified that she got first approached in like 1994. Like, this was all 20 years ago. So there's a legitimate possibility that her memory could have changed over time, and I would say even especially with memories that are associated with trauma, because the human brain has very interesting ways of healing itself and protecting itself from bad memories. So it's that it and the further away you get from those incidents, I think the more likely it is that your brain is going to protect itself long term from those memories. So it's going to be interesting to see how well the prosecution or the defense is going to be able to kind of attack these witnesses and what they do remember from 15, 20 years ago, all of these things that happened. I know that they tried on cross-examination. Good Logic was saying that on cross-examination, they were really trying to push on that. And that is probably legitimately one of the biggest areas that the defense can jump in and really sort of attack the prosecution's case. Do you guys have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's tough being a defense attorney and having a sympathetic witness for this particular case, right? 14 going on this, all these powerful men. You've just heard the names Trump and this and Bill Clinton, former presidents, and now you got this 14-year-old victim. Well, no, she's not 14 now, but you have this victim, and trying to reliving these events. It's tough because you want to impeach them in a certain way, but then you don't want to make them even more sympathetic by the big bad, guy going after them. So it's not a good day for the defense, but I think you have to be able to do your job in a way that's effective. I've seen it done a couple of times. I don't know if you guys ever. I forget have you guys ever seen the 10 Commandments of cross-examination?
Oh yes, I've seen that one. Yes.
If you guys, all right, so this is a story. There's a story the guy tells. There was a huge fire here in New York where it killed a whole bunch of women. It was downtown. It was in the Garment District. So a whole bunch of women got killed in a fire, and it was a negligence case. So they had one of the victims go on the stand, and she gave her testimony. She gave it, this is exactly what happened, right? She was a young woman, and she gave her testimony. So the defense attorney gets up, and he says, well, can you tell me that story again? So she says exactly the same story again, but she missed one word. Just one word. She said, instead of saying like it happened on, for 3 of us, she said it happened to 2 of us. It was just one minor misword. And then after she finishes the recitation on cross-examination, he says, you messed up the second time with the one word. She says, oh yeah, I messed up. I meant to say this. I meant to say that. But what that meant to show was that her whole testimony was so orchestrated that she was saying the same thing word for word, and he was able to pick out the one time she made a mistake, and she said, yeah, I made a mistake. And then he said, well, say it again, the way you really want to say it. And then she said the same exact thing, word for word for word for word. So he was able to destroy her credibility without attacking her, but just by having her say the story 3 times exactly the same way, right? Because if you're telling a story that's traumatic, the story won't be said the exactly word for word the same way. It'll be so different. You see? Legal mindset knows.
I uppercutted my laptop. That's how I know. Yeah.
But that's the way you attack a sympathetic witness like that without actually attacking the witness, right? And that witness now is not credible at all, because it's like, oh, you just rehearsed, you got rehearsed.
But then how did they get away with that without getting an objection from the opposing counsel for asked and answered?
Well, first of all, they have to object. I mean, see Richard's Rittenhouse 2021.
That's true.
But second of all, I mean, you can rephrase, or I think there's a point about recollection, right? If you're trying to point out this fact, this is something that's been permitted. In fact, memory testimony has been permitted, right? That's an expert that is permitted. And I think in the Maxwell case, we actually have an expert, and shout out to Eric Hunley, who's the best of the best on this, on the flaws in human memory, right? Because memory is flawed. This is a factual thing, right? Memory is very flawed. Our memory is based on, the times in which we recalled it. So the more frequently we recall something, the more we remember it, right? But also each time we're recalling it, we're saving different data. So our memory is actually changing, right? And it's scary to think that your memory is something that's not, flawless, but that we're just humans and this is how we do it. Our emotions impact our memory. So you can feel a certain way about an incident, right? And then that feels as if that happened. This is also how Trump TDS happens, right? People feel strongly about something, so it's as if it happened. It's just as real to them internally as if it actually happened.
Yeah.
And this is good testimony. That's a good expert.
That reminds me of revisionist history. Malcolm Gladwell. He has a podcast, Revisionist History. I don't know if you guys have listened to it, but it's so good. It's so good. I love that podcast. But he had one exactly on memory, and he was actually using 9/11 as an example and talking with one of his neighbors, sort of like going through conversations that they had on that day or several days later or something, and completely different memories of that conversation or those interactions that they had. Were depending on whether it was him or his neighbor, they both had like very different memories, because he had some kind of a flight that he had that he was supposed to go on for work or something, and she remembered that he was like, well, I'm flying tomorrow, and she was like, what? That's crazy. But he was like, why would I be flying on the day after 9/11? Like, no one was flying. That's nuts. Are you kidding me? But it's a very, very interesting thing, because you would think that events that are very significant in our lives, for precisely that reason, because they're very traumatic, they're very historical, we're like, we want to remember these things. You would think that we would have actually a better memory of them, but it seems like the opposite tends to be true, because we, over time, for whatever reason, our memories are just malleable.
This is the reason also why that lie detector tests are not admissible in court, because people, it's funny, because just like with the whole plane after 9/11 thing, if that person was to take a lie detector test and said, did you fly on September 12th, they would probably pass the lie detector test, right? Yeah, I flew, knowing that that's impossible, because the lie detector doesn't detect if the person is actually telling the truth. It's just detecting if they believe what they're saying is true.
Yes.
So, and that's a huge difference.
Yes.
Yeah, and Eric Hunley also pointed out in the chat, he also talked about the Brian Williams story about being in a helicopter that got shot down in Iraq, I think, or was it Afghanistan or something? Remember how there was like that whole thing? Everybody was like lampooning him for it, and Malcolm Gladwell was almost like, he was like, I feel like I'm actually trying to like justify his position, like maybe like so that people can understand where he was coming from, that he wasn't lying, he wasn't trying to like score points and across America. Like, he just legitimately didn't remember, which I don't know, one way or another. I still wasn't entirely convinced by that particular episode on Brian Williams, but I mean,
but because people, we can all have the same experiences, but we all have different inputs, right? Your eyes are different than my eyes. My historical references are different than yours. So when I take in this information, I'm processing it through a whole different system than you guys are. So we can all experience the same events, and that's why a lot of times when traumatic events happen, the first thing the police do is separate everybody, right? Because if they get everybody together, the person with the most dominant personality is the story that everybody's going to appear to. Oh yeah, the guy was black. And you're like, no, the guy was actually white. Here's the videotape. Because the dominant personality, then we believe what I believe, and that's the whole jury of one phenomenon too. When you got one dominant juror who then takes over and whatever they think is what the jury thinks. So it's fascinating how we interact with each other, but also how we experience different events, because that's essentially what happens, especially with with memory. So.